Good morning, Ways and Means. It is Friday, January 24th.
Yeah.
We are starting our morning with the governor's budget adjustment memo. And then right after the floor, we are heading to the pavilion and we are going to be there for the rest of the day. Though everyone is, of course, welcome to leave at lunchtime to go find lunch. But we're gonna, because we have a joint hearing at 11 with the Education Committee, it just makes sense to go there for our testimony that's solo before that. So we're not, Source is not moving laptops back and forth and we're not all chomping. We don't have to rush. And then after lunch, we're still in the pavilion for our discrimination, equity, and inclusion training. With some outside trainers that are coming in. We're doing those in small groups and other committees are joining us, but I don't know who those committees are. We'll find out when we get there. And that's promptly at 1 o'clock in the pavilion. And hope we can all be there. I mean, we all have to be there. It's mandatory, but I hope we can all be attentive together when that happens. Thank you. And then we'll be done after that, except for reading more reports. Yay. And if folks ever want to sort of like have a conversation about a particular report, say the word and we will make agenda time for it, though they're certainly coming up as we're going along. So Chris, if you want to join us, we are, I think, the only committee that's sending an official memo for the governor's budget adjustment. I think everyone else is having sort of a conversation and sending an email. We have a lot of very different little snippets of jurisdiction over this. But again, we are not like, this is not an amendment. This is just like a memo that will be attached to an email to the chair. We are going to actually have possession of the budget adjustment bill once they vote it out, because it has expenditures from the education fund in it. And that is always our jurisdiction. Yeah, purview. And so we will actually vote on the budget adjustment bill when it comes back into us. Right now, we're just sending some advice. So with that, Chris, thank you so much for drafting all of the advice.
Sure. For the record, Chris Root from the Joint Fiscal Office. Happy Friday, everyone. Can you see that okay?
It would be nice if it was slightly larger. That's delightful.
All right. I believe this is also posted, but you all had seen an earlier draft of this, I guess it was about a week ago when we went through, and there were a few outstanding items at the time that needed a little more conversation before they could be brought back to you all for discussion. So that's why I'm here. And I highlighted a few sections here that are new relative to what you saw in the last version. There are not a lot of changes, but I just wanted to walk the committee through those. I'm going to skip over the language at the top here and just go straight to the chart and then come back.
That's great. Thank you.
The first item has to do with changing the appropriations for the childcare, the CCFAP program. Last week, we went through the numbers and there was a placeholder here that we wanted to see, I think, what the revenue forecast would look like this week when it was released to see if that would influence your recommendation. The revenue forecast that was adopted by eBoard this week made no changes to the revenue projection. So I think it's you're on safe ground now to weigh in and opine. And I penciled in here that the committee supported the recommendation to align the appropriations to projected expenditure and revenue levels. But I also, after talking to the chair and I think based on some other conversations, put some language in recommending that the appropriations committee take a look at formally enacting reserves with the fund to ensure that there will be sufficient funding to deal with either revenue volatility or volatility on the expenditure side with the program without those costs adversely impacting the general fund. So this is a very fluid conversation right now in the building. but rather than propose very specific language around like what the reserve would look like, this memo suggests that your recommendation would be to do the reserve and then.
And we will get the reserve language
Yes.
back in our committee when budget adjustment actually comes to us. But lots of staff people and Adam Gresham are all just trying to figure out the right language. And when we were at the e-board, it was sort of, this is something that came up in the context of, you know, the new fund. It's not clear how fast it will move up. And my understanding is that JFO is also going to have a memo fairly soon, sort of outlining some of how all the numbers are falling out here.
On the cusp of being finalized.
Great. I love it when things are on the cusp of being finalized. Yeah.
Again, Madam Chair, this is the piece that maybe some of us are getting some emails in regards to.
Yeah.
So the best way to explain this is,
The way I am explaining it, I will not say it's the best way to explain it, is that one, when we passed the big childcare bill, we made childcare an entitlement. And so childcare will always be fully funded because of that. We are not reducing funding in any way. We are just making sure that the new revenue coming in into the dedicated fund is used for childcare. And any extra general fund money is reverting back to the general fund. We are not reducing any funding for it at all. And we continue our commitment to childcare. We're also, given, just general nervousness about a new thing, creating a reserve to make sure that we will always have the revenue that we need in order to dedicate to this very important part of our children and our state and our families. How's that one?
and again, that 13 million initially was seed money from the general fund.
Mhm. Yes, and we'll have a memo with like those details in it, so you can even send that to constituents if you want, yeah. One of the things that's confusing is it's two different 13 millions and that it's, math.
Thanks.
Every year, something like this seems to happen.
That's good.
Chris, again, my question is, when we discussed this last time, there was a question about how much came from the general fund to seed it. It wasn't just the 13 million, it was more than that.
And I believe the memo will contain all of it.
Okay, all right. I guess the other thing I just expressed, Madam Chair, is that the revenues really aren't what keeping up yet with the projected. It's expected that they will be there after the first quarter. So it's just some uncertainty still as to what those actual collections from the payroll tax.
I think it's fair to say that we are very much still in the ramp up phase. So there's uncertainty, I think, on both sides of the equation.
And which is another good reason for the reserve.
Yeah, agreed.
And maybe right now we're talking about specifically budget adjustment, and this is all good, makes good sense. At some point, and maybe it happens at the caucuses or something like that, we need to talk, it would be helpful to talk more about childcare and where we're going. And there's certainly plenty of traffic out there, as we all know about that, and some people got it right and some people are confused about money, but that's our job to try to straighten it out. But not right now. Thank you.
And I do believe the Human Services Committee is going to spend time going deeper and also celebrating the successes of what we've gotten done. Okay. Anything else on this one? Great. Is that like a general thumbs up? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The next one has to do with sections 50 and 61 with the property transfer tax allocations. We glossed over this last week because we needed some additional digging and number crunching and analysis to make sure that what was proposed in fact aligned with sort of what our understanding of legislative intent was based on the two bills that passed. I think there's interest in revising the allocations that were proposed in the governor's BAA because and this is a little complicated, so bear with me for a second. The statute sets out certain percentage allocations for this revenue, and the legislature frequently notwithstands those statutory allocations in order to adjust the amounts based on like current conditions and priorities and things of that nature. The language that was proposed in the governor's BAA harmonized the PTT language in a way that conformed the allocations to the statutory allocations but not to the allocations that you all enacted in Act 113, the budget bill. So the way the statutory allocations work is it actually would have reduced some money for planning activities, whereas the legislative intent last year was not really to do that. It was to increase some funding. So the recommendation here would be to change the PTT allocations that were in the governor's recommended BAA to align them with the same percentages that you all adopted when you did the budget.
And that's partly that's part of a general principle that budget adjustments should align with the statutorily with the budget that it's following, right? And this was incredibly confusing because there were sort of three different places of possible precedents to be drawing from.
So, Madam Chair, so where that money that was the governor's proposal took away from planning, where was it going?
So it was all about how it would be reallocated. And we're really talking about a small sliver of funding from the increase from the rate that went in from Act 181. If you remember, that was the piece that also had the tax on, it was the higher rate on non-primary residences, like second homes and things of that nature. If you look at the language on page 34 of the governor's language, which is on the JFO website, you'll see that the allocations that were proposed actually would have reduced funds from planning and put more in, or I should say the additional increase would have gone to the general fund, but it was how it was allocated. Didn't make a lot of sense. And most of the increase would have gone to municipal planning rather than regional planning. And a lot of it would have also gone to the Center for Geographic Information. The changes that would be proposed would increase the funding for regional planning by $1 million instead of decreasing it slightly, and would have actually increased the funding for municipal planning by a little over 100,000 rather than by the nearly $1 million increase that the governor proposed, and would have slightly increased the allocation for Center for Geographic Information from 436,000 to 507 instead of going from 436 to 905. So it's all about reallocating that money that's sort of in that box for those three things, because as it was originally proposed, regional planning would have received a cut. And that was not really the intent of Act 181 and the land use reform law. That was like, there was a recognition that regional planning would have needed more resources, which is why the legislature approved the allocations they did in Act 113. So this would just shift a long rambling way of saying, this will shift a little more of the increase into regional planning and a little less of the increase to municipalities and to the Center for Geographic Information, but all three would still be seeing an increase.
With an acknowledgement that all of the Act 250 reforms require a lot of work on the ground from the regional planning folks.
The page number on the.
Page 34, it would be section 50.
Representative Brennigan?
Chris, is this the chunk of money that there's a small fraction of it that goes to water quality? And is that money changed?
That is a totally, that's the clean water surcharge. That has nothing to do with this.
It is sort of close to it visually though, so that makes sense that you would ask.
My people are right on the lake and water quality is big. So anyway, okay, thank you.
And actually, I very much appreciate your vigilance on water quality. We're actually, that, you know, that fee is supposed to sunset soon, so we're gonna actually have to do some work on it this year. Yeah, figured you were. Yeah. Representative Feltes, did you?
Do we know why the governor wanted to switch them around?
I don't specifically know. I think there's a lot of ways you can interpret how to divvy up this money. I mean, there's the allocation in statute. I mean, this was the topic of a conversation. So I think we really did need to figure out how best to proceed here. For statute, those three buckets, 70% goes to regional planning, 20 to municipalities, and 10 to the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. What Act 113 did was, instead of 70% for regional planning, it's 82.4. Instead of 20% for municipalities, it's 12. And instead of 10% for the Center for Geographic Information, it's 5.6. So at Act 113 that you all passed put more money into regional planning, but everyone's still getting a bump.
So much did you say for PCGI?
It would go from, in statute, it's a 10% allocation. They would be getting 5% under Act 113, but they're
It's a
still
bigger-
getting an increase. Everybody's still getting an increase in dollar terms. Clear as mud.
I guess
Yeah,
I'm just thinking that the allocation was based on a estimate of what the actual revenues would generate. If you would generate, right?
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about is anybody receiving less money than was originally anticipated based on the allocation?
I believe so. Ted, is that true?
Ted Brennan, Joint Fiscal Office, that is true, and in the.
What is true when you say that?
That there's no one's receiving a decrease, yes.
Thank you.
In the latest consensus revenue forecast, there's a little bit of additional PTT money. So yes, indeed, I'm reconsidering this, the changes from, what is in this piece and what are you?
So everyone gets more in BAA. Some folks get more, and some folks just get more. Okay.
The next piece was the transfer from the Liquor Control Fund. You heard testimony from Commissioner Knight on this. And I think when we went through this language, we were holding this open pending, hearing that testimony and reviewing it. I've penciled in here that since this proposal would effectively bring the Liquor Control Enterprise Fund back into balance, the committee was supportive of it. And made a note here that the committee is generally supportive of efforts to ensure that enterprise and special funds do not incur persistent deficits, and that the committee would welcome and appreciate advice from Liquor and Lottery on how to avoid the recurrence of a deficit in this fund in the future.
Thank you.
The last piece then that I skipped over.
Just make sure everyone knows that means we will then get advice. And so we should be ready for the advice when we get it. Okay.
So I'm going to go back to the final piece here was the piece I skipped over at the very beginning of the cover memo, which speaks to an issue with marriage license fees. You all received a walkthrough of H6 2 weeks ago from Chairman Lalonde. And what H6 would do is repeal the sunset that is currently in law on marriage fee or marriage license fees. Right now, under status quo, under current law, the marriage license fee will revert back to $60 beginning July 1. And doing so would reduce funding to the Domestic and Sexual Violence Special Fund by about $72,000 a year, and also to town clerks statewide by about $24,000 a year or so. Just for some context, we on average do about 4,800 marriage licenses a year. So it's, with some variation, but absent any legislative action this session, the special fund, the Domestic Violence Special Fund will lose the $15 they're currently receiving from that $20 increase. And that would result in a revenue reduction to their fund. For some context, they brought in slightly less than $600,000 last year. And their revenue sources consist of $50 from the marriage license fees of the $80 you pay. And they receive a portion of the $47 Judicial Bureau surcharge on things like traffic tickets and civil and criminal violations. They receive $13.50 of that. The language here highlights the fact that this committee has in the past, and I think continues to be concerned with finding a sustainable funding source for these vital programs. And the current funding sources have a bit of a questionable nexus to the programs they fund, which I've often heard voiced around this table and around the building. So I editorialized here and said that the committee would hope that while the committee does not want to take away from these vital programs, that the committee remains concerned about how they're currently funded and perhaps in recognition of the fact that these are broadly applicable public safety functions, they should be funded in part from the general fund rather than dedicated revenues that have a questionable nexus to the programs they fund.
And I just want to name from a process perspective, I think moving a standalone bill to remove a sunset is a great way for everyone in the entire building to think that we are creating a new fee rather than removing a sunset. I think generally we remove sunsets or adjust sunsets in the context of a much larger bill. We are about to get very, very busy and swamped. I think in some other year, we often put changes in sunsets in our miscellaneous tax bill. I just feel very concerned with like what's about to happen to our workload. And so want to get like absolutely everything out of the way as soon as possible. The Judiciary Committee is continuing to take testimony throughout the year on, the domestic violence network of support and all the work that they're doing, and we'll continue doing that. And we can't get in front of the clean water sunset because that is like a much, much larger project that the Natural Resources Committee will need to take testimony on. Yeah.
In this committee, oftentimes we extend sunsets.
Yeah.
And this time we're repealing them.
Mm-hmm. Rather than just extending it?
Right.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did, when the language left the House last time, it didn't have a sunset. And it came back with a sunset. And so I felt like the House position was no sunset, but it's also a new biennium. So who knows what the House position is anymore. So just like making that right, like,
Madam Chair, I appreciate your
Yeah.
sharing with us your strategy on getting this out.
Yeah.
More to be said and recognized, but I appreciate your giving us a heads up on that.
I'm sure, so what you're saying is we are gonna take a further look at this
Mhm.
in this year, okay, again, yeah, no, appreciate that.
I agree that the money is necessary. I agree that I'm not crazy about it being on an energy licenses, all of these other things that we discussed. But I disagree with the process of doing this in the budget adjustment as opposed to the regular budget.
Mhm.
It's not necessary until July 1, 2025. So there is time. We could look at H6 all by itself. And I understand that might be complicated. But typically, in the Appropriations Committee, we have preferred to not do I think this is a policy decision, to do that within the budget adjustment. There's policy stuff that goes into the budget, and the regular budget in March, we could say, yes, we're going to extend this sunset, or we're going to remove the sunset and have it be permanent. I think that would be appropriate in the budget, but not when we're adjusting last year's budget,
Mhm.
current year's budget. Because it's not an urgent issue. It can be taken care of later on.
Mhm.
I don't think it's the adjustment. Yeah.
I think that makes some sense. Yeah.
Appreciate your comments. I'm thinking of it. I also know that when we do things like this in the big bill, and we're talking on the floor, or hearing a report on the floor, I think many of us, myself included, our ears kind of glaze over in terms of what we're hearing, and so we really, it's hard to know what we're saying at that time, because there's 13 layers of stuff going on,
Right,
so.
right.
So, I don't disagree with you. I appreciate the strategy that you have to understand why, and there'll be other instances where we need to get things up front so that the members here know what we're doing and why.
Yeah.
I just think it tends to be even more buried if we do it in the budget adjustment as opposed to the actual budget. In the budget, it would be brought out and says, yes, we're extending the sunset, or we're removing the sunset, or whatever. As opposed to burying it in something that's supposedly just not ins and outs that, haven't been worked out just exactly. And that's what you do in the adjustment bill, as opposed to the regular. Or do it totally separately, but I realize that's.
I appreciate your particularity about it very much. We need to send this memo yesterday. And we're going to get the bill back ourselves. We'll have a fairly short amount of time with it. So I'm wondering, and we need to go to the floor. So we can leave this language in and continue the discussion amongst ourselves. We can take it out and continue the conversation amongst ourselves.
Is your compromise the wording that is in here?
That's what it feels like to me. Yes. Yeah.
I'm okay with doing that.
Okay.
And then, reviewing it when it comes back to us.
Okay.
And I also had a nice little speech prepared on the necessity of fees, which we have just pushed down the drain. But if we were still doing an annual fee bill, this kind of thing would be caught. And
Yes.
we wouldn't have this struggle.
Mhm.
But I like the governor, so I'm gonna keep my mouth shut.
Okay, I think with that, we're going to send the memo along and we will continue our conversations next time.
Motion or just
No,
informal anyway?
we're-
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for, thanks.